Good evening, everyone. I'm Claire Berry, Director of Conservation at the Kimball Art Museum, and I'll be in conversation tonight with Michael Gallagher, Sherman Fairchild, Chairman of the Department of Paintings Conservation at the Metropolitan Museum. We are so delighted that you're joining us tonight. This is the second in the series called Kimball Connections, in which a present staff member at the Kimball engages a former staff member in a discussion about their experience of working at the Kimball. Michael and I go back a long way. We worked together here in the early 90s. It was Michael's first job, and it was my first experience in hiring another conservator. And there's a lot of material we have to cover tonight. This is going to be a very informal discussion, and we do welcome your questions. You can just type them in the Q&A box and we'll answer some questions at the end. Let's just get started. I want to start by asking Michael a little bit about his experiences, his very first experiences in conservation before he arrived at the Kimball. You studied conservation at the Hamilton Carr Institute in Cambridge and then did your internship with Andrea Rota at the Getty Museum.
So yes, hi Claire, and hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. Yes, this is me looking remarkably young. On the left, just after I'd finished the 3-year postgrad course at the Hamilton Carr Institute, which is a department of the Fitzwilliam, is under the umbrella of the University of Cambridge. And to my left is my colleague. The Institute at that time just took 2 students a year, so it was a very intensive training. And that's Marika Spring, who I'm very proud to say is now the head of scientific research at the National Gallery in London. So we both turned out okay.
You both had stellar careers.
And after I finished it's very typical after the 3-year training at the Hamilton Carr Institute to go on to an internship or fellowship. And I was lucky enough to get a place at the Getty Museum. And it was an extraordinary year. I'd never been to America before, and I had a whole year there. And you're seeing there Andrea Rota, who was in charge of the department and was a wonderful conservator and a wonderful mentor. And then it was just a stellar team there of Mark Leonard, Yvonne Safran, Elizabeth Mention, who I've stayed in touch with all these years. But it was a great first sort of museum setting to cut my teeth.
And in these days, you were still at the Villa. This was before the Getty
Yes.
Center had been built.
Very much.
And then in
so.
1993, you moved to Fort Worth, Texas, to work at the Kimball Art Museum. Here's a view of the museum with the Henry Moore sculpture in front. And we'll show a couple of views of the studio. The building was designed by Louis Kahn. The architect is shown here on the right with one of the engineers he worked with, Frank Sherwood. And there on the left is Ted Pillsbury, who was director when you were at the Kimball, standing next to the Sonneradom from our collection, showing the north-facing window that we have in the studio, which has incredible light. It looks out onto this courtyard. And actually, it's an area that even visitors to the museum can see from a distance because of a series of windows. When they walk in the East Gallery, they can look through the first set of windows across the courtyard and into the studio. This was even more accessible before 9/11, when visitors could freely walk into the office area. And frequently we would find people with noses pressed up against the window looking into the studio. This is a view of the studio on the right. When you were here, Michael, some of the paintings that you worked on, the Nathaniel Dance at the far right. Mm-hmm. And again, a view from the courtyard on the left looking into the studio, just to give a sense of the space.
And I remember, Claire, you'd can't quite see it, but you just cleaned the Ribera that is off on the left, and you were working on the Goya that is on the left there, the still life.
Yeah, that's a beautiful still life with woodcocks from the Meadows Museum in Dallas at SMU, for whom we also do conservation work. So with Michael's arrival in 1993, it was the start of a shared conservation program between the Kimball and the Amon Carter. So we were officially taking care of the European paintings at the Kimball, the American paintings at the Carter, but also had the opportunity to take on special projects from places like the Meadows as well. In many ways, I was modeling the department after the Met, though on a much smaller scale. But the Met always had that kind of combination of paintings from the permanent collection, paintings from the Frick, and sometimes other museums. I just wanted to highlight, for those who don't know, our then director, Ted Pillsbury, was incredibly close to John Brealey, who was at that time the Sherman Fairchild chairman of the Department of Paintings Conservation at the Met, the job that you now hold, Michael. And John was the person I trained under after when I started my internship following graduate school. And he had an enormous influence on my conservation practice, and even a strong influence on my moving to Texas to work at the Kimball. And you might want to say something about your memories of Ted and what it was like to work with him.
I think one of the fascinating things, as you said, you gave me my first job in conservation. I'd like to pretend I was a lot younger. I had other jobs that were nothing to do with conservation before I started training, but that was my first job. And one of when I've talked to people who became assistants later with you, Claire, what is unique to the Kimball is as an institution, it punches way above its weight. That's slightly now out of date, that statement, because the Kimball has grown so much since I was there in scale. But it's always been an incredibly ambitious institution in everything it did, in acquisitions and exhibitions, in research, and the staff it hired. And often as an assistant conservator, if you go into a smaller institution, perhaps the smaller institution doesn't have the same ambitions as a large one. Or if you go into a slightly larger one, you sort of are very, very, very small fish in a very large pond, and you might be lucky for people to learn your name in 2 years. The Kimball was completely different. Ted, as you remember, took a very active interest when you interviewed me. I was sent around a whole group of different people, also in Dallas. And it was very typical, if there were visitors, important visitors came to the museum, that he would round us up for lunch. And I think it would be very unusual for the average assistant conservators to be invited to a lunch with maybe 2 directors and senior curators. It kept you on your toes. It was a little intimidating, but it was in a way a wonderful trial by fire. And we always knew that if a new acquisition was say being considered or had come in, he would expect every book to be at hand and the X-ray ready to go up, and there would be a sort of Ted's coming, with a visitor. But I think that that level of engagement that was expected, that exposure to the full roster of activities in the institution, was just a wonderful introduction to the profession.
This idea of bringing visitors to the studio, this was something that I certainly experienced at the Met, my time at the Met with John Brealey, in a number of ways. We were expected to collaborate with everyone in the department and talk in front of our painting and be able to explain what we were doing, what we were thinking, with all of our conservation colleagues and also with the Met curators. And I remember especially Keith Christensen was and is still, I believe, an active visitor to the studio. And John would also, he started a series of seminars bringing together curators and conservators at the Met in the early 1980s. And here you can see 2 views of one of those seminars. These photos present a kind of who's who in the museum world at the time. I see the young Philippe de Montebello, Joe Rischel, Patrice Marindel, Pete Bowron, and many, many conservators. In the back, there's Mark Leonard, there's Alan Goldrock. And it was very important to John that curators and conservators work together in the conservation of works of art, that we really needed to share our knowledge. And he also tried to bring in conservation science, so that he really emphasized this idea of collaboration. And I think that is something that very much resonated with Ted in the way he engaged us with the visitors, as you were saying, and was proud to bring visitors to the department to show off the work that was being done, and just to present the idea that we were trying to build a serious conservation department at the Kimball. This was the team. And, you know, when I was preparing this PowerPoint, I thought to myself, Ted looks so sweet and benign in this photo. And which I think, and
He could be.
John really would say, Ted is a pussycat, you know. And I remember John telling me a story when Ted Pillsbury was director of the Yale Center for British Art. I guess a lot of the curators were very angry at him, and John would pull them aside and say, you don't understand. He's in there fighting for your job. Sometimes I think Ted was, could be more complimentary to you behind your back, but he was somebody who I think expected a great deal from the people he worked with. And, you know, you really wanted to bring your best game to the table. And he had a way of just kind of appearing in the conservation studio without notice. And his footsteps made absolutely no sound. And you could be caught totally off guard, not realizing he was standing over your shoulder, watching you, you know, work on a painting. What I really value thinking about Ted now is how much he cared about the work we were doing, and how much he was promoting it and making it really part of the fabric of the Kimball Art Museum. I wanted to ask you what it was like when you first moved to Fort Worth. And there's a photograph of the young Michael Gallagher on the left.
Wow.
Living in your first apartment, which was right across the street from the Kimball. And actually, on the right, you can see what is currently standing there. Those apartments were later torn down.
They really had to obliterate every trace.
Yes, it's now the site of the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth, which opened about 20 years ago. And I remember you telling me about this Christmas tree that you decorated.
No, I mean, one of the things.
Did you send it to your mother, or the photo?
No, what happened? I mean, just to go back to, you know, I'd spent a year in LA, and rather naively, I thought, okay, I've done America, and moving to the Kimball and to Texas would just be, you know, fine. I hadn't, you know, I hadn't anticipated just how different the places were. But one of the things looking back that I really hadn't anticipated was, as you said, this was my first real job and in conservation. And it was, you know, very intimidating to turn up. It's very different when you're a fellow somewhere and it's a finite period of time, and the expectations around you are very, very different. So it was a very intimidating moment. Everybody was, as they always are in Fort Worth, super hospitable. But I really felt, you know, completely out of my comfort zone. And I arrived, I think, so in November. And this was the first Christmas tree I'd ever bought independently. And I was very proud of my Christmas tree. And I took this photo in rather sort of bleak looking apartment, and I sent it home. And apparently my mother burst into tears on seeing it, because obviously I wasn't going home for Christmas. And, you know, I looked like I sort of collapsed to my knees in sort of sadness. But actually, you know, I was happier where I moved to, but yes, first
eventually
Christmas.
Moved downtown where I was living, and there was a group of us down there. It was later Joaquin Pizarro, the chief curator at the Kimball, and Sarah Cash, who's now curator at the National Gallery. There was a group of us who moved downtown, and that was quite a good time.
Urban Pioneers.
So just to give another image of your social life in Fort Worth, you were quite popular at the Kimball. When I called Ian McClure, who was your teacher at the Hamilton Carr, for a reference, he described you as universally popular. And that was certainly my experience of working with you at the Kimball. You were very much beloved, and if not even the life of the party.
Yeah.
Wonderful sense of humor. And do you remember Jeanette Schnell?
I have to jump in because I just want people to know there was I mean, there's many layers that could be added to this, but I didn't normally dress like that. This was, I can't remember who hosted it, but it was an Oscar party and we were all told to come dressed up, hence the hideous cravat. But Jeanette Schnell is in the foreground, who was our administrator, and our own, at the time, Jennifer Kassler with the sunglasses, and Paula.
Catherine Wan.
And Catherine Wan and Paula.
And Paula Phipps.
Who were also all Kimball people.
Yes.
Let's move on.
This was one of your first major projects at the Kimball, the cleaning and restoration of the Salvatore Rosa.
Mm-hmm.
And and here we see before conservation, after cleaning. Is there anything specifically you want to say? We have a lot of paintings to look at tonight. So
yeah, I won't dwell on it. I loved working on the painting. It was Pythagoras emerging from the underworld, it was challenging because it was sort of abraded in the darks as they often are, but it was a great thing to work on.
I want to show you this these details showing at the top the areas of abrasion before Michael did his very careful retouching, and you see the completed the after photos at the bottom.
And I would say, John Brelia tragically had a stroke in, what year was that, Claire? Was that
I believe it was 1989.
89. But he had made a recovery, but his speech was very, very impaired. And Ted, as loyal as ever, always had John visit regularly. And that's with his nurse, Louise. And John actually, I was working on the Rosa when he came, and it was the first time I'd met him, and I was so intimidated because John had a formidable reputation as a, he made a huge impact on conservation writ large in the US. And I was having real problems getting a varnish on it because it was so worn from treatments way in the past that it would take the varnish very unevenly. And he actually took a very active interest, and we sort of troubleshooted the whole thing with his input, which was great.
I'd like to maybe jump in and say, in thinking about this discussion tonight, I know I've drawn in a lot of people when I've been in a treatment. I've readily accepted advice from certainly people like John, Andrea Rota, Hubert von Sonnenberg, other colleagues, but equally, and I think that was hopefully encouraged in the department, but equally, I must say that I've learned a great deal from every one of my younger colleagues that I've worked with over the years. And I just think, again, collaboration is a good thing when it comes to conservation. Someone might have had an experience with a varnish, or that kind of a absorbent canvas that you hadn't had before, and we just learned from one another.
Well, I remember when I arrived, it really struck me, that aspect of you, Claire, that sometimes people are very reluctant to pick up the phone or acknowledge that someone has had more experience with an artist or has encountered a problem before. And, you never hesitated to just find out the most you possibly could about whether it was the picture, the artist, the issue. And I learned from that, because I think sometimes people, especially coming, straight out of training, there's a tendency to want not to want to fully admit what you don't know, and you look back later and think, oh my God, I don't know. At that time, you know so little, and you don't know so little. So it was a great experience to see you open to that, and then how a treatment would benefit from that.
Well, this is a good example of that. And I just, following on your thought, I have to credit two of my teachers, Sheldon Keck in graduate school, who once during a lecture on, he was giving a lecture on Van Gogh, and I asked him a question, and he was a very erudite man, and he said, I don't know. And I thought, that's so liberating. You can say that, I don't know. And then John Brealey used to always say, pictures will always make fools of you. So if you approach it with, I might not know, and the picture, there might be something more I need to learn, it tends to open you up to.
I remember being struck. I was working on a Remington, and Colin Bailey, curator at the time, came in, and it was a nighttime scene, but some of the retouchings in the sky, very small retouchings, had turned white. They chalked, and it's when zinc white is sometimes used in retouching, it can happen. And I remember Colin realizing that this was coming off, and he said, oh my God, I always thought those were stars. And I thought it was the most, it's someone who has real confidence in their extraordinary ability can just let their guard down and say, oh, I'd misunderstood that, which is very rare, but is, I think, a wonderful quality, as you say.
Well, you'll remember this acquisition, which was a major acquisition for the Kimball when you worked here. At the time, it was not attributed to a specific artist. It's a portrait of Jacob Obrecht. You see it on the left before cleaning. And I was struck by the fact that Philippe de Montebello, then director of the Met, took the time to send a quick note to Ted congratulating him on buying such a superb painting when we had no idea who the artist was. And speaking of consulting with others, I remember consulting with Hubert von Sonnenberg at first about the cleaning, because this posed some challenges. It had a very absorbent blue background, and yet the surface of the portrait itself had a very kind of eggshell-like surface, and it just didn't seem like the normal way that we would approach a cleaning would be appropriate here. I'm just showing you a few details here. On the left, there's an infrared image of infrared reflectography, which shows some of the underdrawing in this early Netherlandish portrait. There was really very little underdrawing that we could see. We could see a few adjustments to the shoulder on the left. But this is one of the tools we use for this period of painting. It helps with the connoisseurship and helps with the identification of the artist, because Northern scholars really study the underdrawings of these paintings and use that to help make attributions. And we sent it to all of the leading scholars, and everyone was stumped. So it remained unattributed for years until more recently, my assistant, Rafael Barrientos Martinez, proposed an attribution to Quentin Matsys, which Larry Silver agreed with, and they published. But you remember the frame, Michael, that I think there were wooden additions all around that yes. I think you removed, revealing on the right the original location of the hinges. And you can see in the middle image there that underneath this layer of gesso and gilding, we found that the engaged frame had originally been marbleized, this beautiful burgundy marbleized pattern. And so the cleaning involved not only the portrait itself, but eventually a very careful chipping away of the gilding and the gesso to clean the frame. Very fortunate at this time when the painting was in the studio that Andrea Rota from the Getty visited the Kimball, and I had the opportunity to look at the painting with him, and he suggested an approach to cleaning, which is what I followed. He said, instead of doing what we would normally do, which is start along the edge, perhaps making a test along the lower right edge in the surplice and the blue background. He said, just locally try to reduce the stains across the surface of the painting. That way you can stop at any moment and you'll maintain full control. You may decide to go further, but it will allow you to stop at any moment. And that is, I thought that was very good advice. And that's exactly what I did. Apart from the loss that you see in the surplice, a couple of losses there, the painting was in amazing condition. And there you see before and after. And you'll remember the Barnes exhibition, of course. And there on the left is the paintings as they're normally installed at the Barnes. According to what Mr. Albert Barnes, his very strict protocol, he made the arrangement of the pictures. He liked them displayed with the metalwork, with the Philadelphia Dutch, the Pennsylvania Dutch furniture, and the paintings were never ever to leave the Barnes. They were never photographed in color, and it was very difficult to gain access to visit the Barnes Foundation in those days. You had to make an appointment, and it was quite controversial when they decided to that the collection could travel, and that Kimball was very fortunate to have the collection come here. And Colin Bailey, who was then curator, was instrumental in making that happen. And so just to compare and contrast how the paintings looked at the Barnes on the left, and then how we had the opportunity to see them in the wonderful silvery light of the Kimball against travertine walls. It was really quite a revelation. And maybe I'll play this short video of Colin describing the installation.
Everything is uncrated under the eye of the representative of the Barnes, with our conservator, with our registrar, so that a whole team of people inspect, almost like in an operating theatre, they inspect each work of art as it comes out of the crate.
You remember our, sorry, how do I get out of that?
Just move to the next slide, Claire.
It's not going. There we go. You remember our wonderful team of preparators.
Yes, yeah,
Michael.
I was seeing Larry there as well.
And they have, they've done a superb job all these years with the exhibitions that Kimball does. What was unusual at that time too is that we had to give over all of the galleries for the permanent collection were used to show the Barnes collection. And so Ted Pillsbury and Colin Bailey devised a plan to show some of our best paintings in the office area. And this is a schematic showing the arrangement of the paintings in the office pool. Again, this was something that could only happen in 1993. This would never happen after 2001, just to highlight how things have changed. And the note that the card sharps by Caravaggio and Roysdale's Stormy Sea would be shown upstairs in the bookstore. So literally the public would be outside my office. You'll remember we had over 500,000 visitors to the exhibition. It was quite an amazing time. And remember that you and I hosted a symposium coinciding with the Barnes exhibition to talk about conservation with curators. And you see there Colin Bailey on the right, Allison Green from the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. There you are on the left. And I think it was very successful. Again, modeled after the seminars that John started at the Met. I looked at this photo on the right and thought, why are those people not masked? You know, again, we haven't seen this kind of a crowd of people unmasked looking at art in quite a long time. And you remember the swimming picture.
Oh
This
gosh,
was,
that was.
to our listeners, this was one of the first important paintings bought by a public institution in Fort Worth. It was bought by the Fort Worth Art Association in 1926, Thomas Aiken's swimming picture, and then ended up in the collection of the Modern Art Museum. And during the time that Michael worked at the Kimball, it was then sold to the Amon Carter Museum. Over the years, the original frame had been lost, and so it was shown in any number of frames. But because of this change in ownership, and because the painting went through major restoration, the curator then at the Amon Carter Museum, Doreen Bolger, took it upon herself to visit the Modern Art Museum and asked to see their storage in case she could find the original frame. And that's exactly what happened. So the very elaborate exhibition frame you see it in is the original frame that Doreen discovered in storage. Michael, again, this was before we had Photoshop. Michael and I received a sepia photograph postcard of the group of women dancers on the right from Colin Bailey, who was on vacation in East Hampton. And Michael just grabbed it out of my hand and ran to the photocopier and did this cut and paste and sort of merged it with the image of the Aikens painting. And I think
Forgive me, Mr. Aikens.
something quite convincing, as if the painting might have been cut down from a larger image. A lot of fun. And maybe you could say something about the Matisse.
No, this was like this sort of example of a pretty early on, actually. I think when I arrived, and an acquisition with tons of people coming through to see it, with Colin and Ted wanting to do it for us to examine it in every way we could. You're seeing in the reverse the staining through, how directly painted it is. We used transmitted infrared to pick up on changes in the execution, during the execution of the composition, which you almost wouldn't expect on a picture that seems so direct and so free.
We were thrilled to be able to buy it in unlined condition. What we saw in that earlier sample comparison is that there was another set of inscribed lines beneath the surface. And then in the course of treating the painting and doing our research, we found that it had actually been published with a completely different lower left quadrant that was black, but we recognized the incised lines as being the same as the ones we had detected beneath the surface.
And we should say Matisse, those were Matisse's changes.
And they were Matisse's changes, and this kind of working practice was quite normal for Matisse. He or his assistant, it wasn't at all unusual for them to take maybe a turpentine soaked cloth and wipe out some passage of paint that he wanted to change. I suspect there were other changes that we can't document as clearly. For example, you could see that he started signing this picture in the upper right and then abandoned that signature. So that was probably another area of change. We could see that the canvas was soaked through to the back there. But I think so this practice was quite common for Matisse, and maybe even anticipates his working with colored paper cutouts. But I think what's especially interesting in this case is that it was actually published in its earlier state, and then he went back and changed it again. To create a more unified red background. Michael, maybe you can take over and discuss what's happening here.
Yeah, I really like this picture. I treated it, and in the end, I think Ted decided to. Oh, I'm not seeing the other one on the other side. yeah, anyway, so we'll just go back for a moment to the raising of Lazarus. It was eventually deaccessioned from the Kimball, and oddly, it now belongs to someone I know very well, a collector in the New York area, who is actually also on my visiting committee, so I'm glad that I have seen it since then. The picture on the right, which just looks like I did nothing else other than stupidity, but Beverly Brown, who was curator at the Kimball at the time, was doing research into a very well-known painting by Tintoretto in Munich of Vulcan discovering his wife Venus with Mars. And there is a mirror in the composition over on the far right that reflects the group of Mars and Venus, who Jeanette and I are reenacting the position. And the whole thing was to sort of see, but what Beverly was interested in was whether it was an accurate reflection or not. And Kimball photographer Michael Bodycomb set it up. And then as a gift to Claire, I used one of the black and white photographs and just painted over it like a sketch at a later date, outside of work time. I hasten to add, but there was a vaguely legitimate academic reason for this setup.
I still have it on my desk and enjoy it every day. I remember when we talked recently, Michael, you said that, I think you said that it was at the Kimball that you did your first public speaking. Ted would ask us to give talks in the galleries, especially in relation to a special exhibition. And I think one of your first gallery talks was with the Tiepolo oil sketch.
The very first was Bassano. And then I spoke on the Rosa, and I did speak on the Tiepolo. But what Ted would just sort of say, and Michael, you'll give a talk as well, and you'd think, oh, will I? And then you had to sort of think, well, what am I going to talk about? And the great thing I learned from that was usually if you looked at the catalog and then you went through the exhibition, a talk would emerge. You would, looking at the pictures, there's always something to talk about. And that was a good lesson to learn.
Well, I appreciated his bringing conservators into the exhibitions in that way. And of course, in later years, that led to technical studies and contributing to projects, which we'll talk about with this next image, Georges Latour, the Cheat with the Ace of Clubs, which was actually treated at the Met. I was one of the people who had the chance to treat it when I first arrived. But during Michael's time at the Kimball, we decided to undertake a technical study of the painting. And this was in preparation for an exhibition that the Kimball eventually mounted with the National Gallery in Washington, Georges Latour and His World in 1997, which you could see that the Louvre version of the composition, The Cheat with the Ace of Hearts, was paired with our painting. It was very beautiful and interesting exhibition, and also led to a seminar in conservation, which I'm sad to say I don't have a photograph of. When we examined the painting with infrared, we could see interesting pentimenti. The head of the maidservant was shifted to the right. Maybe you can see that initial dark profile to the left. But Michael, I want you to take over here and talk about the process of autoradiography and how we both took the painting. The painting was shipped to Gaithersburg, Maryland.
So the new technologies really have replaced this. But if you think of X-rays as mainly a map of the distribution of very heavy elements, principally lead white or something like lead tin yellow. Paintings are made up of pigments that contain many, many other elements, which X-ray does not reveal in any way. So this was the autoradiography. It had been used in the Met on a whole set of Rembrandts. And the idea was to do the same with the Latour. And it sounds more alarming than it probably is, but the painting is exposed to radiation in a reactor. So this was taken to Washington, to Maryland, to NIST. Is that the National Institute
The
for
National
Standards and
Institute
Technology?
of Standards and Technology, Gaithersburg,
And
Maryland.
it's a brief, it gets this brief activation. And so for a little while, a matter of weeks, individual elements give off signature beta radiation. And by placing X-ray plates directly on the surface, that radiation exposes the plate. And specific elements, say manganese in the color umber, it has I'm going to forget the technical term, but you do more or less like half an hour after radiation, you put on the plates for half an hour. An hour after radiation, you put a plate on for an hour, and it goes up until the last one is a week after the irradiation. The plates are put on for a week. And
Even
so you
more
get
than that, a month. We did exposures of a month.
Yeah. And their signature to certain elements. And they take quite a bit of interpretation, but that, if anyone followed that, that is the basis of autoradiography. And I'm very glad we don't do it anymore.
Well, you worked with Dr. Tony Chang, and you physically put the painting inside this nuclear reactor with his help, and then you had to quickly move it down the hall to a special room where you could activate the first exposure, which was 15
I mean, my
minutes.
role was as to also to remind everyone that this was a great, very important, very valuable work of art, and not just some sort of experimental rat. And so, and to run interference, if anything, seemed to, in any slight way, was going to put the picture at risk. But we got on well, and all went smoothly.
And one of the discoveries made was the existence of this kind of loose outline sketch in manganese-based pigments, perhaps dark ochres or umbers, which wouldn't have been detected any other way. It would not have been detected in X-radiography or infrared reflectography. This image is a little bit difficult to read because you're reading some interference of a lot of pigments that were applied to the reverse of the canvas during a previous lining. So we don't get that also contain manganese. But if you look around the perimeter of the turbine, you might see some very sketchy outlines. And this was one of the important takeaways from that. We mentioned earlier the Bassano exhibition, and Michael, you spoke at that. This is the Bassano at the Kimball's collection, which maybe was the idea behind doing the Bassano exhibition. And I just want to say, I remember you giving your gallery talk, and you certainly have a gift for talking in front of works of art. And I especially remember you talking about the baptism on the right. And Peter, my colleague here, who worked with you at the Met, who trained at the Met under your direction, pointed out to me that you later cleaned this painting at the Met. So I just have a before cleaning photograph. This was how it looked when it was at our exhibition at the Kimball. And is there anything you want to say about that?
The interesting thing to me was, if I'm honest, at the time of the exhibition, I didn't really get the baptism. It's a late picture. It has a kind of non-finito, unfinished quality to it. It probably was. It was right at the end of his life. And the painting, the Royal Collection painting you're seeing on the left, were the sorts of why I had fallen in love with Bassano. And I think it's always good to remember how your tastes change and become, one hopes, a bit more, God, are we allowed to say that, but sophisticated, in that I think of the baptism now as a glorious, incredibly soulful painting about sacrifice, where Christ already seems bowed by the weight of the cross. And, and I always, when I talk about this painting, I'm always quick to say, this is not me trying to, the subject matter is a biblical subject matter. It's a religious subject matter. But I think you can also connect with it on very universal human level of the idea of someone giving themselves over to something they don't want to do. And it's just beautifully, beautifully painted with a kind of fearless application of paint. So it was very interesting. It was a challenging treatment, but it was also a great privilege to work on it.
And then you left the Kimball, and you had a great opportunity to go and work at the Gemäldegalerie Gallery on a special project, the Versailles Altar.
Yep.
Um,
So yes, through a Getty grant, I conserved all 8 panels of the Versailles Altar. They're about 5 foot by 5 foot, 5 foot square each, from 1437. And really extraordinary, very, very different from something like Bassano, but really extraordinary works. And this is when I'd completed the side with the life of the Passion of Christ, and it was in the Dahlem Museum before we moved to the Kulturforum that you just showed. They did an event, which was not typical at the time at the Gemäldegalerie Gallery, for the public before they were going to show Dahlem. And I don't think I have ever been more nervous than having to talk in German, in probably very, very bad German, in front of the public. And it's a great leveler, because you think you can be reasonably articulate in English, and then you have to try and say something in German, and it starts to become this bit good, this bit bad. Yeah, there I am.
I remember you saying that you really focused primarily on practical work, on working on these pictures in Berlin. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that experience of
I think what it taught me was, I've always loved practical work. It's what took me into the profession. But I did have I realized it wasn't quite enough, that just going in every day to work through a painting, and then another one, and not really, there wasn't much appetite, as I say, for the time. This was unusual, for sharing that with the public. I wasn't at all involved with the broader world of that institution. And I think it just told me that, that I didn't want to be a private conservator, that I loved being in a museum, but I also wanted to be in a museum where I had a role that was broader than simply, working on the paintings.
And then you were hired by the National Galleries Scotland, the Scottish National Gallery, when Sir Timothy Clifford was director. So you got your wish. You stepped into the lead position in the department, and also you supervised a number of other departments.
Yeah, I've been 4 years in Berlin, and then I was hired in the National Galleries of Scotland, and probably was hugely naive. I'd never managed anybody, and I had to manage the conservation department, which was both paintings, paper, and frames. Maybe a dozen people. And then after I'd been there a little while, I was asked, or somewhat made, to manage the registrar's department as well. So it became a very heavy managerial role. I was at the gallery 6 years.
You still found time to work on major pictures, including this Benjamin West, which gave you the experience of actually treating a painting in public. And what was that like?
There's a reason I've never done it since. I'll say very quickly, this painting, which as you can see is very, very large. Sir Timothy Clifford, who was pictured before, really wanted this to be worked on. It looked rather sad for itself, very discolored varnish. It was it was the end of the gallery and very dominant. And the only way we could have got it to the studio was to have taken it off its stretcher, rolled it, taken it over to the studio, unroll it, stretch it, finish the treatment, roll it. It was unacceptable. So I tried to make the best of a situation I couldn't get out of trying to open up the process to the public. It taught me a lot. It gave me my favorite title for a talk, which I gave after it was finished, which was Thoughts from the Scaffold. You know, I just realized that there's quite a lot of people are very keen now to do conservation in front of the public, and it has its place. But I also think that it's a bit of a minefield as well, and I'm not. Conservation isn't something that lends itself naturally to sound bites, and so just popping in to see somebody work on something for 5 minutes doesn't really tell you the whole story. But it all came good in the end, and that's the great gang, you know, framing up the picture after treatment.
And then there's this great picture, the Sandro Botticelli, the Virgin adoring the sleeping Christ child. Shall I start? And then I'll hand it over to you.
Are we doing therapy?
At the time, yes, this is
and it's
therapy.
10 to 8. It's 10
I know
to
we're going to have to
12,
really pick it up. I'm sorry to the audience. There's still all the Velázquez to come. We'll make this quick. At the time this painting came on the market, our director at the Kimball was Timothy Potts, and this had been offered to the Kimball, and I was very keen and really encouraged Timothy to have the painting sent to the Kimball. And when it was sent here for examination, I was only more excited by the picture. I mean, here looking at it, it looks like her cape might be a discolored azurite blue, a blue that sometimes darkens with age. But in fact, I got it in the studio and realized that was all lapis lazuli. There was gilding at the centers of the flowers. I was very excited, but it would need an export license from England. It was coming out of a Scottish collection. So the painting was sent back to England. And here's where you take over, Michael.
Well, Sir Timothy Clifford became determined that it should stay in Scotland at the National Galleries of Scotland, and he was a formidable fundraiser and a formidable foe if he set his mind to something. And so the short story is, it did stay in Edinburgh at the National Galleries, and it. You know, I hadn't been so long at the galleries when this was acquired, and it was an extraordinary privilege and also quite an intimidating challenge. But it's a picture that still makes my heart beat a little faster. And it was an extraordinary transformation. It was such a discolored varnish. Berenson, the art historian Berenson, when he had seen the picture at Gosford, didn't believe it. But he referred to the flesh tones looking like a burnished brass. And if you just go back, Claire, to I mean, you can see why, how distorted it was by the varnish.
But my memory is that Timothy Clifford's, and this was really getting down to the wire. I mean, the Kimball was literally about to buy the painting. Export license had been applied for, and Timothy Clifford got wind of this and sent you on the train to go examine.
Yeah, I went down to London. And the day before, I arranged to see Martin Wilde, who's keeper of conservation at the National Gallery in London, who is incredibly kind mentor. And we went through the gallery together, and we went through the storage together, and we looked at Botticelli, and we looked at workshop. And he helped prime me, I think, for going to see the picture, because my role was both to look at the condition, but also they were expecting a reaction to the quality. Like, is this, because, you know, there were a lot of followers and there was a workshop. And I had an hour and a half with the painting on my own, and I just completely fell under its spell. I just thought it was an extraordinary work of art. That gives you an idea of just how distorted it was. But everything about it, those roses just seemed to be like almost had a sculptural sense of placement that just made the hair go on the back of my neck. This is right when the picture had been completed in the studio in Edinburgh. And it got a lot of attention. And initially, I'll just quickly say this, initially, people, as they always do, talked about the cost, which I think was around about £10 million, which now seems like such a bargain. And there was an art historian at the time who I think brilliantly, and I've used it since, when asked about it, because what people do is they start to talk about something like hospital beds. Well, the money that paid for this was never going to hospital beds. It's just a silly comparison. And he just said it would pay for 2 miles of motorway. It would be like saying it would pay for 2 miles of freeway. And I think it's such a great thing to remember, that what things cost, you have to keep them in balance. This is a fabulous painting for the public can see now at any time. And it's not 2 miles of motorway.
Well, it was a very amazing time. And to realize that the two people in a way that we were representing, that you and I would work together at the Kimball and were such good friends, we were working for the two museums that were competing to buy this picture. And though I was disappointed at first to lose it, I was so happy to see that it was going to such a great collection and that you did such a beautiful restoration. And also this, I think I can say this picture was very key in your life because it opened up a lot of things. First of all, you told me that Keith Christensen came, the curator from the Met, came to see it in the studio. And this was the first time you met him.
Yes.
And I think you talked about how at that point the painting was off of its stretcher and he was.
Yeah, I mean, Keith came, and what I was struck by, it was off its stretcher. I was having to do the structural work and he couldn't get far enough back from it. And he asked, it was on a board, could we lay it on the floor so he could look at it from a bit of a distance, which we did. And then Keith is very tall and he just suddenly just straddled it. And I nearly but what was, and of course, came to no harm. But what struck me was we had a number of art historians through who were like very guarded poker players. They'd always ask who else had been and what they had said. And Keith just rattled off. He was convinced by the quality, he was convinced by the authorship, he dated it. He said it's just like the Daughters of Jethro at this point in the Sistine Chapel. And afterwards I went and it's like, oh gosh, he's right. So he made a huge impression, but it was this picture was the reason he recommended me to the director of the Met, Philippe de Montebello, for Hubert's successor. Right.
And here we see the painting before and after cleaning. It was a total transformation. And the picture also led to your meeting Mark Powell, because the Frick asked you to come to New York and lecture on the painting, and that's where you met Mark Powell, your now husband. So it was it led you to Mark as well.
Yeah.
And then we were very happy at the Kimball to have a chance to borrow it when the masterpieces from the National Gallery came. This exhibit came to the Kimball in 2015, and now we're at the Met. What year did you start at the Met, Michael?
19. Oh my God, I'm blanking. 1995. I'm like, no, that's rubbish. No. Hang on, that's total rubbish. 2005. 2005. Okay. The simplest question has just got me.
No, we still have so many paintings.
Yeah, I think we should move. So I know this is the fabulous Bellini, St. Francis in the Wilderness from the Frick. The Met has always had a relationship with the Frick. We do the work for them. We didn't treat this, but my colleague Charlotte Hale did a very, very thorough technical examination. And I think just, you'll have all picked up listening that this ongoing theme of, the model of John Brearley and so on is alive and well still at the Kimball and at the Met, yes, where colleagues come from other institutions. There were colleagues here from London and elsewhere who came to see the painting. That's on the right, there's Keith in front of it talking. And it was like having a rock star in the studio. People would ask, was there any chance of coming to see it? But it was great.
And now we have a section on Velázquez.
Yeah, I mean, this is Keith Christiansen, who has been one of the greatest gifts I've had at the Met. The relationship with him has informed my whole experience there. He's incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly passionate about paintings, and he loves coming to painting conservation. This was a loan from Modena. And one of the exciting things that happened while I was there was Keith asked me to consider treating this painting, which was buried in varnish, and in cleaning it, it was recognized that it was indeed by Velázquez, not by a later follower. And we believe very strongly that it is actually a self-portrait by the artist, and just a wonderful picture. The painting on the images on the right are a later self-portrait, about 10 years later, and we're just flipping the image to give you a combination. And I think the two things I'll just very quickly say, those sort of bulges above the eyes, the bony structure above the eyes, and that very particular nose where it flares out at the bridge, comes back in, flares out again at the end. There's a I think, a very strong resemblance.
Absolutely. I mean, you've had the privilege of working on a great many paintings by Velázquez. I was really blown away when I realized.
It struck me when we were talking about this, when I arrived at the Kimball, you let me go in the summer for the first time to visit Madrid. And I got to go into the Prado out of hours, and I met one of the conservators. And I was being shown around the studio, and I said, is there any chance of going into the galleries while it's closed to the public? And he said, well, no, not really, it's difficult. And he said, was there something you wanted to see? And I didn't realize, but I just said the magic words, anything by Velázquez. And it was like, oh, okay then. And we went down, and there was no artificial illumination, and it was just daylight. And he said, oh, climb over I always get emotional when I talk this, climb over the rope. And just to see one painting by this artist after another, I just left thinking, okay, he's the greatest artist who ever lived. And they went back the next day when it was open to the public. And I chose not to go because I wanted to hold on to that memory of them being just mine, just for one day. But these are, I worked on, while Colin Bailey was the curator at the Frick, he asked me to work on the Frogger Philip on the left from the Frick. That's the self-portrait. And then this is in a private collection, a wonderful, very direct sketch of a little girl.
Wonderful group.
I didn't work on the Wanda Pereira, but we couldn't resist putting these together. I did work on the 2 Hispanic Society pictures, but yeah, good day at the office.
Good day at the office, indeed.
I think we'll move on. I think this is the full length of Philip IV that I worked on, and then the next one, which is quite a damaged picture, is the big Charles Lebrun, one of the great last gifts of the wonderful benefactor of the museum, James Reitzman at the Met. Allowed us to buy this extraordinary group portrait by Charles Lebrun. Which was a bit of a mammoth task.
And it is extraordinary, Michael, the amount of practical work that you are able to do at the Met, that you've been able to hold on to that while really fulfilling a very important administrative role. So hats off to you. I mean, it's beautiful, Lebrun, after treatment. And very quickly, we'll go through this recent acquisition.
Yeah,
very transformative treatment that you did on this small panel.
So yeah, very quickly, this is Bohemian master from the mid 14th century that was acquired by the Met in October of 2019. It took a while to get it to the museum, and it was the first picture I went to treat after lockdown in July of 2020. And I had to remove overpaint under the microscope that had been put over the entire background, probably in the early 19th century, that revealed a picture in truly extraordinary condition. This painting is about the size of an iPad, but it is just a glorious jewel, and it will go on display, public display, probably later in April.
Congratulations, it's beautiful. I mean, a total transformation. I mean, there's nothing like the feeling, I think, for a conservator to discover a painting that is so well preserved,
Yep.
Under this layer of later restoration. Now, we'll end up with a few images. You are a painter, and you've been doing more and more painting in recent years in the country in Dutchess County, where you have a house. There's a beautiful self-portrait. You are a plein air painter. These are some sketches that you've done. Note the sgraffito, like we saw in Matisse. You're not afraid of moving around paint, leaving around some places of bare canvas. I think it's wonderful. And some of your recent paintings on view in the Gallery and Goods in Pine Plains. So I know we've gone over time, but I did want to allow some of our viewers to ask questions. So let me see if I can pull up the, oh, sorry. Oh dear. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Michael, can you pull up the questions on your?
Yeah, I'm just looking. It says the Bassano paintings show the same measurements, yet the left painting is clearly a horizontal painting, while the right painting is vertical. Please clarify. Not sure. I'm afraid I understand. Maybe that's a mistake in the measurements on the slide. I think I can't quite remember the slide, but that's the only thing that makes sense to me. I think it's probably just a typo.
Okay.
Apologies for that.
Other questions?
No other questions. What technical developments do you expect to transform conservation in the next decade? Would you like me to take a stab at that, Claire?
Take a stab at that.
I think one of the things we've seen that's radically changed is the power of imaging. What can be, and certain kinds of analysis allied to imaging. So Claire and her colleague Peter van der Mortel recently acquired scanning XRF technology, and that technology depends on the power of imaging. What I would say is, and this is just my little soapbox, I think there are two things. We have always benefited from advances in technology, but the poetry of paintings is something that exists aside from technology. And I think one of what I hope runs in parallel is, yes, advances in technology that help us understand, help us treat things more safely, but also a retention of a belief in that poetry and the works of art are far more than the sum of the materials.
My sister has written in without, well, I lost it now. I think it's a question about how are other ways that museums are sharing conservation with the public. And I think the Met's doing a very good job of that. You're posting things on Instagram about projects and treatments and showing details. And I think you've done a very good job at that. You have a lot of viewers to those posts. Anything you want to add to that? Certainly, we write essays, we give lectures.
There was a time, I gave a talk very recently about our departmental Instagram account. Please all subscribe. And I said, I think Philippe de Montebello, who hired me at the Met, the director, who I have nothing but huge respect for, he, I think, believed that, I think I said in the talk that, like a good host, you didn't let people into the kitchen. The work happened elsewhere and it was not helpful. And I think, we all know that most people want to hang out in the kitchen. And Philippe has, I think, really come round. He's on my visiting committee. I think he's seen that understanding pictures and how they're treated does not necessarily diminish their impact. It can actually be a way in for people who are perhaps not so comfortable with art history or going through what the narrative is in a particular painting. So I think retaining a respect for the work and not sort of wanting to draw attention, not that this is the bad evening to say this, but to draw attention constantly to yourself and your work. You're all laughing, I'm sure, somewhere out there. But I think all the conservators I respect the most are people who have a really deep felt love for works of art. And I know we haven't got much time, so I would be remiss if I didn't say to everybody that you all may know that at the end of this month, Claire will retire from the Met. And
The Kimball.
from the Kimball. And I just want to say, I was thinking about this, and all great relationships are give and take. And the Kimball needed you as much as you needed the Kimball. What you have brought to that institution, I was talking before about punching above one's weight, in treatments, in research, in connections, in publications. There should be one of these just devoted to your work, Claire. You're hugely respected nationally and internationally. And you gave me my first job, you took a chance, you made it an incredibly engaging, thoughtful, exciting, fun process or work life. And you've done that to a whole set of young conservatives on great things, like someone like Elise Effman, who leads now in San Francisco. The way you have, because of your contribution, because of your passion for the institution, for your love of Fort Worth, for wanting everybody to care about the Kimball, its collections as much as you do, you've been a sort of ceaseless champion there. And Eric Lee refers to you as being part of the DNA, but I just wanted to pay tribute to that at the end of this talk, because it is truly a singular contribution.
Well, thank you. That means so much coming from you. And you know that I have the greatest respect for you too, and your contributions.
No love fest here.
But, and Keith has written in that looking at pictures with Michael is such an eye-opener, and his hire at the Met was one of the great things Philippe de Montebello did.
No,
I couldn't agree more. And I think we could answer more questions, but we've held our viewers now for over an hour. So maybe with that, we'll sign off. And thank you all for joining in. Michael, thank you so much for giving such a great program tonight. We could go on and on talking about the pictures you've worked on and the many great projects you've done. But thank you for being such a great friend and great colleague.
It's a pleasure. Good night, everybody.
Good night.